that she has taken the time out to come and speak to us today. Christine's current title is Director of Opening Worlds, which sounds amazing. And in very exciting news, has got a brand new set of books coming out with Hodder called Changing Histories. This is a set of textbooks that have taken a brand new approach through a story-based approach, bringing together historical scholarship and inquiry, which presents a truly diverse, inclusive and ambitious history curriculum. The final thing that I would say before I pass over to Tom and Christine is that I don't think I can really introduce her any better than she introduces herself on Twitter as Truth Seeker, History Geek and Girly Swat, which I think a lot of us here can probably resonate with. And today she is going to be doing some truth seeking with us about her recent Teaching History article about assessment. And I, for one, am going to be glued to my seat. So I will pass over to Tom and Christine, and thank you so much for giving up your time today.
Welcome, Christine. How are you? Oh, you need to unmute yourself, bottom left.
There's a rookie error. Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me, Tom.
Yeah, thank you so much for doing this interview. We really, really appreciate it. And I know everybody is looking forward to what you have to say. Just in case anybody's unfamiliar, first off, with the sort of context of which we're talking about, there's an article and the title of which is Laughing Muppets, Lost Memories and Lethal Mutations, Rescuing Assessment from Knowledge Rich Gone Wrong, which you can find in Teaching History just as a reference point. And in this article, Christine sets out her concerns about the effects on history teaching of recent trends in secondary assessment practice. And this I think it was like an 8-page article. So this is a very, very brief summary from the conclusion, which we're going to dig into it properly. But in the conclusion, Christine says, if formative assessment relies on constructs unrelated to history's natural modes of accounting, in brackets, story, textured scene, argument, it misses multiple opportunities to make history more memorable and may damage pupils' experience of history itself. History lives, is learned, and carries meaning through its accounts. Now, Christine, I want to start off with when you initially shared this article on Twitter. You said it was going to put the cat amongst the pigeons. Can you tell everybody why that is?
Yes. Well, let me explain why I decided to write it, Tom. And thank you very much for asking me to talk about the article. It's in Teaching History 193, if anybody wants to look it up, because we're only going to be able to have a brief time together. I think what drove me to write it is that, and this needs no introduction to the audience here, history is just a wonderful subject. It is amazing. It should be one of the subjects that make children want to come to school. Great, I've got history today. I want to go to school. And why is that? Well, just summing up, there's great diversity in what the greatest history teachers do. But, I think there are two things which underpin those strengths. One is a quality of enchantment. That's a term I think that Jacob Olivey and Mike Hill often use, a quality of enchantment. It's like you cast a spell on the children, isn't it? A sequence of lessons goes somewhere. And it's often lots of little stories joined up, or it's one great big story, or it's a story you're then going to unpick and deconstruct. But that story is glorious. And the children are on their edges of their seats as you pace it. It's beautiful, it's enthralling, and you are captivated. They are enchanted for the duration of that inquiry. But secondly, alongside that is a puzzle. So you've usually got some sort of analytic direction, some inquiry question driving it through. And again, each lesson, you're thinking, oh, gosh, now I'm thinking about the puzzle in a different way. Oh, now we're looking at the inquiry question in a different way. And the teacher is guiding you to answer that question. And that's really, isn't it, how the substantive and disciplinary interact. The thrill of puzzle and the thrill of enchantment. But alongside that, we could also say that history is a very important subject for reasons I don't need to rehearse to this audience. So it's something wonderful and extraordinary. We have sophisticated ways of bringing that out. It is critically important to bring children that historical consciousness. And yet we can damage it really, really badly through assessment. And really, I was motivated to write the article by making the point really that damage is completely unnecessary. It shouldn't be necessary. We should be learning from the past. So I make the point in the article at the start that we're not short on extensive and very easy to find solutions for great Key Stage 3 assessment. The good stuff isn't hidden or obscure. Teaching History is full of it. The blog that the HA does, One Big History Department, is full of it. Yes, there are some history teachers who don't know about it, but often that's caused by really weak initial teacher training. There's no reason for anybody not to access great assessment. There's no shortage of models where assessment is doing a useful job and is not remotely interfering with the quality of pupils' experience of learning history. But what triggered my desire to write the article is really two problems. And one is very, very long-standing. And that first problem, in a way, is a problem of, I like to think of it as collective amnesia. Just a sort of collective forgetting in a system. And this doesn't just affect history, of course. Collective amnesia going back for 35 years. And this is the ever recurring problem of taking a hierarchy of skill-based descriptors designed for summative purposes, and then using that hierarchy to assess formatively, i.e. in routine embedded day-to-day assessment or in half-termly progress checks. And in the article, I point out the deadening, stultifying effect that such assessment has on history teaching, and how every time it happens, it is frequently widely observed and helpfully analysed by many people, teachers, leaders, and others. And yet, despite the fact that it's exposed as being a problem, the problem then returns. And I chart the way in which it has returned 3 times since 1991. And I wanted to use the article to point out, and I suppose this is my cat among the pigeons, perhaps, to point about the very high likelihood that the same problem will recur again. It's recurred 3 times, it'll recur a 4th time. We're in a slight, but very fragile, I would say, lull from it at the moment, since the 2019 Ofsted framework finally caught up with a growing consensus on the ground on this. After that damage, I would say, had been substantially worsened by Ofsted before 2019. And the other problem, so that's the skill-based descriptor hierarchy problem that keeps recurring. But the other problem, which was my second cat among the pigeons, is the problem which has perhaps caused a bit of a rumpus. And on the face of it, it is a completely new problem. But do see the article where I show the connection with the old problem. And that is the one that I've styled as knowledge rich gone wrong. And this is a double tragedy. Knowledge rich gone wrong and damaging assessment is a double tragedy, because the very thing which has long helped to counter the problem of skill-based descriptors, a proper attention to the flow and form of historical knowledge, is, in my view, becoming highly distorted in some current pedagogy and related assessment, which is being imposed on history departments.
Let me say, Christine, when I read the article, I'm going to put my hands up. I'm guilty, because but I did get out of it in your article, though, because it said it happened in 2014 when I made a skill-based descriptor. So I felt bad, but good, because I was like, oh, it happened in 2014. That makes me okay. You know.
Yeah, you're redeemed, Tom.
Yeah. You said in there, I mean, tell us a little bit more about the problem of the first 2 issues that you raised with these skills-based descriptors. What's the problem with relying on them? There might be some history teachers watching this. I know we've got a lot of international history teachers watching. They might not know what you're talking about here. So it'd be great to give them that context.
Sure, delighted. Thank you. I mean, what I mean by this, I think the best way of characterizing it quickly and practically is that it typically takes the form of an over-reliance on command verbs. So I'm talking about, and then a creation of a hierarchy out of those command verbs, for example, leading into a question. So, for example, identify, describe, explain, evaluate, analyze, you know, the sort of thing. And then treating that as an assumed hierarchy. And it also takes the form of a related attempt, often, to isolate properties of disciplinary thinking. So let's look at what progress in causation looks like. Okay, we'll break that down into I can find a cause, I can find lots of causes, I can link causes, I can classify causes, I can do a full dance with bananas and causes. So, you know, this assumed hierarchy, the isolation into a set of skills, which feels very tidy. It looks like you're capturing a thoroughly good thing. We all know that learning to argue causally is a thoroughly good thing, but actually it's profoundly distorting. And we see this in the old level descriptions, which were abolished in 2014, but we also see it in an improper use, an overuse of GCSE questions and GCSE mark schemes where they're used inappropriately lower down the school. Now, what it can't describe what those kinds of hierarchies of skill descriptors can't describe, can't allow you to measure, and certainly can't provide the means for, is actually getting better at history, because it's trying to capture the final performance, the wonderful causation argument, the exam answer perhaps, and to sort of carve it up and imagine that the journey towards it is a sort of carving up of those final attributes. The reality is, the way in which we become proficient at history, the way in which we learn to move about within our knowledge sufficiently to do something interesting with it, doesn't look like that. It looks completely different. We have to move through a series of things, including getting really, really secure in the knowledge, including experiencing different forms of argument and practicing different forms of argument. And it's like a faulty breaking of it down into spurious components. And if you try to use it for formative assessment, if you try to use it routinely, worst of all, kind of day-to-day assessment, parking a level on a particular piece of work, you get really horrible distortions. Now, why don't they work? They don't work because they're an inevitably faulty hierarchy. I can evaluate X. Well, I can do that at postdoctoral thesis level, but I could also teach an 8-year-old to do it perfectly competently. The difficulty relates to the range, specificity, accuracy, diversity and richness and appositeness of knowledge. It doesn't relate to that particular verb, evaluate or identify. Secondly, they don't work because they leave out substantive knowledge. And thirdly, they don't work because they imply a spurious precision, which distorts that steady, rich, slow burn, if you like, an indirect process of truly teaching disciplinary thinking and argument. And they invariably supplant curriculum itself. So, the history curriculum, what we teach children, the substance children learn, is there to change the child. It's there to alter what the child sees, what the child recognizes, and therefore what the child can do. But if you jump over that curriculum, if you confuse performance with learning, you not only don't bring about that change, but you create damaging assessment, which actually yields a set of lies. So if you think about before level descriptions were abolished, pre-2014, heads of history are under pressure to show that X proportion of children had reached level 7. But what did level 7 mean? It meant that children could practice a formula. And now often it's, pushing them up to be able to practice the formulae for a level 2 or level 3 of a GCSE mark scheme. And yes, the child can rehearse the formula to perfection. So why isn't that always translating then into, say, a grade 5 in GCSE? Well, it's because you're trying to replicate the wrong thing. We're teaching to the performance rather than learning. And when the bulk of your teaching at Key Stage 3 or your frequent 6-weekly interruptions to your teaching are geared to this, you're not only going to get meaningless data, but you won't help pupils to improve. And worst of all, we just create a dreadful, joyless experience of history teaching. And in the article, I chart the continuities in this over 35 years. But what's much more depressing, the thing I really wanted to focus on, is this. It's the fact that there have been repeated, collective, widely understood realizations that all this is a problem. And yet, despite that collective realization, usually within a few years, the whole thing gets reinvented again. And do read the article, everybody. But there I chart how that has happened 3 times. The abolition of level descriptions in 2014 was one of these realizations. It's perhaps the most recent one. It's the kind of one in the middle, if you like. The recent one came later. The abolition of level descriptions in 2014 arose from one of these realizations that there was a real problem, that real damage was being caused. But then the whole problem was invented a 3rd time, but this time with a new atrocity for good measure, the use of GCSE questions and mark schemes at Key Stage 3, which is simply more generic skill-based descriptors, turning the teaching of history into the drilling of crazy formulae, which have nothing to do with good history teaching, and certainly nothing to do with gaining the substance and studying the structure of historical knowledge. Now, last point on this. All this was only halted in 2019 by a new Ofsted framework, which was a radical turnaround, one which actually caught up. Ofsted was catching up with what many teachers, especially history teachers, had been saying for some time. And in a deliberate attempt to stop it, they said inspectors would not look at internal data, and they emphasised that the curriculum the curriculum itself is what creates progress. So look at the quality of the curriculum, look at how well the curriculum is being learned, and not a spurious and premature clambering through GCSE mark schemes.
There's two parts to the next question I've got based on that, Christine. Part one is, you seem very sure this is going to happen again within that chronology. So part A is, why do you think that? And the second part of that is also just reflecting on what you said there. If the inspection framework has changed, if level descriptor has been abolished, if there's less focus on pure data for schools, and et cetera, now what's driving it? What's sort of why are you so worried this is going to happen again? Why is it going to happen again?
Yeah, really important question. Thank you for asking that. I would say there's two reasons why I'm worried. The first is, I said, 2019 has given the good history teacher cover, so that you could cover to do the right thing. But that's all it's done. It's given them cover to do the right thing in some settings. I would say that old problem hasn't completely gone away. That's the first reason. Even with Ofsted being pretty clear about these dangers of assessment supplanting curriculum and rowing back on looking at internal data, what is striking is how many schools, and this is a school level problem, not a history teacher level problem, how many schools have still clung to this practice of GCSE mark schemes at Key Stage 3, and even using it for flight paths, for example, and making predictions. And we've got some reasonable data on this. I think the best sampling you're going to get of it, which is Tim Jenner's most recent, the HMI in charge of history in Ofsted, Tim Jenner's most recent Ofsted subject report, which estimates around 50% of schools still do this. Now, that you can see that as glass half full, glass half empty. On the one hand, that's great, because I think it was probably in the 90s before, so it's only 50%. Or you can say, well, how very worrying. Even with Ofsted creating a climate that discourages these practices, 50% are still clinging on to it. And that makes me worry, really, that the transformation is fragile, and that where it has happened, it might have happened through compliance rather than through conviction, which is always very worrying. But the other reason why I think it won't, it will come back, is not just that it hasn't fully gone away, is that it is intrinsically seductive. And this answers the second part of your question. If you think about it, we all want history so much more than just knowing stuff. It's being able to do something with that stuff. And we want children to be critical. We want them to have disciplinary thinking. And that's so well established, isn't it, in our communities over 30 plus years. So, of course, sooner or later, someone comes along and says, right, well, this evaluating is really important, isn't it? This construction of argument is really important, isn't it? So let's assess it as it goes along. Let's find a hierarchy of skills which shows progression in that thing. And before you know it, someone's reinvented it. So I think there's something about it being intrinsically seductive. It's about the deceit of the obvious. So I think this transcends any issues of predicting around, what might be happening in terms of policy circles or current or future Ofsted. I think there is something intrinsically seductive about that model, which means that those who don't know that history, those who haven't been brought up in it and helped to reflect on it in great history ITT, for example, or those perhaps who haven't got senior leaders who think about these things, are very, very vulnerable to it happening again.
Do you think, though, just to play devil's advocate, there is a disconnect between what is expected within GCSE exams, for example, for history and how they're marked? Can you sort of see why a history teacher might think, hang on a minute, right? At the end of the day, a lot of the students, whether we like it or not, might not be engaged with history as a subject. They might not like it. And I suppose there might be something seductive of saying, well, let's try and prepare them for the exam. I know that's a sort of
that's depressing, isn't it? That's depressing. And I totally agree. I'm sure that does exist. But that's a broader comment too, isn't it, on system and culture. Leadership of schools should be about challenging that, shouldn't it? It shouldn't be something that falls on the back of history teachers. Are we doing the thing that intrinsically matters here? Am I incentivizing doing the thing that intrinsically matters? I mean, once you've said, I've given up on this child finding history interesting, or at least I'll get them through the exam, you have failed, you have lost. And I don't blame a history department if they feel they've reached that point and the enabling conditions are not present, and maybe they haven't had the training or the experience, and senior leaders are demanding something of them. So I don't blame the history department for doing that. I think that is a reality, but is in effect of a system and a culture that isn't placing first, isn't making the primary duty of a senior leader to ask, the primary duty of a senior leader to be interested in subjects. If a senior leader is first and foremost interested in creating a narrative, a management narrative, before they're interested in the business of understanding truly subjects and what it is that genuinely helps children to get better, then it's going to be very, very hard for this problem to go away. So we need broader systems and policy to incentivize that.
Let's focus on the bit where you were talking about knowledge rich going right, knowledge rich going wrong. What can you tell everyone a little bit about what you think knowledge rich going right looks like?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for asking that first. It's so easy to get into the depressing bit, isn't it? Yeah. So I'm going to sum it up in 3 ways, 3 things that I would say, just sum it up at a high level of what knowledge rich going right looks like. I would say, number 1, a knowledge rich history curriculum, as I understand it, and I don't see this as a new thing. I think it's something history, this isn't something that sort of emerged in some recent Govian influence, that might have allowed it to get some daylight, and it certainly, certain currents allowed it to come out, but this is something quite long standing. It's had a long gestation period amongst many stables of history teachers. So the first thing I would say is that a knowledge rich history curriculum paints complex worlds on human scale. It doesn't try to oversimplify them in unhelpful ways. Those past worlds, those distant, strange past worlds, get imagined through very rich and vivid detail in a knowledge-rich curriculum. Rich and vivid detail that paints material culture, spiritual culture, and through that human scale, through those stories of real people, those real examples, it helps people to understand the more abstract things, alien institutions, complex past ideas, unfamiliar motivations or moralities. And without this hinterland of world building, I heard Emily mention world building at the end there, at the end of her lovely presentation. Without this kind of hinterland of world building and this quality of enchantment that it brings, where pupils are seduced by story into seeing and being interested in, say, the texture of an institution, many of those abstract phenomena will remain inaccessible abstractions, especially for pupils who are hitherto low attainers or have certain special needs. So that's the first thing. It paints complex worlds on human scale. The second thing I would say is a knowledge-rich history curriculum weaves narratives. It weaves and connects narratives which operate on different scales and within differing spheres of human action. And storytelling is not just a pedagogic device in history, it's the way meaning is made. It is the very object of study too. So history's chief mode of accounting is narrative, and without narrative, nothing is ever stated other than free-floating fact. So knowledge-rich history stays close to that natural mode of accounting. It doesn't distort it with alien constructs like skill hierarchies. Thirdly, and most important of all, perhaps, a knowledge-rich history curriculum trains children to question those narratives. And this is because those narratives are always constructs. They're ones which can wield power, even dangerous power, through subtle influence and hidden argument. So this, I think, this third point is really the disciplinary dimension, isn't it? It's about inducting pupils into traditions of responsible argument and their standards of evidence, and fostering pupils' confidence that as citizens of a democracy, they have a right and a duty to engage with those long traditions of inquiry, those long traditions of debate, and a right and duty to renew those traditions and debates by joining them and joining those inquiries themselves. So 3 things: painting the past, painting complex worlds in human scale, weaving narratives, and questioning those narratives. That for me is what knowledge-rich history is all about.
I've got a couple of questions left, Christine, just to finish off. Before we jump into those, probably a good time for me to give a shout out to our sponsor today, which is Time Travel Education, who are a fantastic tour company and VR agency for history teachers. So if you're interested in finding out more, you can visit them at timetraveleducation.co.uk and find out a little bit more about them. The other thing I'd like to mention at this point as well, if you're enjoying this event, we have our science event next month on the 20th of April in Manchester. It's completely free for classroom teachers. So if you have a scientist that you know in your history department, or who happens to be anywhere in the UK, actually, who wants to travel to Manchester and join us for that free event on the 20th of April, definitely check out ttradio.org/events. You'll find it listed on there with a link to the ticketing, and definitely get involved. We've got I think we've got more than 15 amazing speakers, and it's going to be fantastic. So, Christine, just to move on to the last few questions now. It all sounds, what you've just described there, it all sounds like really good history teaching, almost mainstream history teaching, what people consider that to be now. So how does it go wrong in the context of assessment in particular?
Yeah, this is the chief cat among the pigeons, isn't it? So I would say, Tom, that just as with the skill-based descriptor hierarchies, where you've got an alien construct, so with this, we find an alien construct gets imposed on history teaching that completely distorts the learning. So just as with if you think back to what I said about the skill-based descriptor hierarchy, that was taking the principles of final performance and trying to fast track them without doing the deeper work of the curriculum. So with knowledge rich gone wrong, I see an alien construct being created. And what I'm observing is up and down the country in many different settings, this same sort of thing going on. And my concern is, in effect, if I can sum it all up with something very provocative, my concern is that teachers are being expected, and I stress again, it's rarely coming from history teachers themselves. My concern is that history teachers are being expected to make history behave like science. Now, I explained this in
That's
depth.
a good quote. Now we should tweet that one out, Emily, in the background. That's a really good quote. Can you say that again? Can you say that again?
So my concern is that teachers are often, we should stress, because it's not happening everywhere, but often being expected to make history behave like science. And, I wouldn't want it to happen the other way around. I wouldn't want science teachers to expect science to behave like history. I don't want anyone to have their subject made to behave like another subject. So I explain this in depth in the article, and I won't try to go into all the corners of it right now. But let me give you one example, just one example I refer to in the article. And I think it's one that people will recognize. So, and this can be subtle. It can be a good thing that then gets distorted into a bad thing because it's lost connection with the subject. My example is a kind of routinized use of retrieval practice. So talking now at the very formative and informal end of assessment here, which is very regular, but a routine use of retrieval practice that has lost connection with the subject's natural forms of accounting. And this is really sad because narrative and argument, and narrative with argument in the middle of it, narrative and argument, history's natural modes of accounting, provide really easy and highly purposeful opportunities to retrieve prior knowledge. As the plot unfolds, as the scene opens out, as the inevitable desire to predict galvanizes a pupil's imagination, the story's journey itself, prompts retrieval. You think how a novel works, think how a film works. It does it brilliantly and subtly and integrates it. So inviting explicit retrieval at that moment can feel part of the narrative flow. So let's take an example. So let's say we're studying, I don't know, Baghdad in the 9th century, take a popular, increasingly popular Key Stage 3 topic, although really it's in primary curriculum. And here we are, we're enthralled by the passion of the caliphs for seeking out knowledge. And we're fascinated by the fact that the caliphs are even going to their Byzantine enemies to get the knowledge of the ancient Greeks. Why are they doing that? Okay, let's remember year 7. Why is all that knowledge in the Byzantine Empire? Where is it in the Byzantine Empire? And what form would it take? At that moment, you're crying out for that prior knowledge. You need it. You want it at that moment. And it's going to unlock what's going to be new. It's the ideal moment to retrieve it in an appropriate way. So systematic recall can be a really, really good thing. It's essential, in fact, and it can add to the suspense. And similarly, in disciplinary terms, the recall of particular material can support structured stages in an unfolding analysis, the journey towards an inquiry question, the journey of shaping an argument in response to an inquiry question. Yet often, I don't hear that. I hear we've been told to have a quizzing exercise at this point in the lesson. Or worse than that, this quizzing exercise must have 5 questions, or it must be multiple choice. So rather than being assisted and strengthened by the retrieval which proceeds from the story we're in or the analysis we're pursuing and an appropriate form for that retrieval, children's memories are actually being overloaded sometimes. What an irony there is there. Their memories are being overloaded with clunky or decontextualized questions only loosely related to the account being shared or shaped. Now, there are many other examples in the article, and my particular crossness in the article is reserved for the abuse of knowledge organisers. I won't even get started on that because I'll set the computer on fire with my crossness. What's going wrong here? I'll just conclude with this because I think it's important to get at the root of it. I think what's going wrong here with this sort of clunky, inappropriate recall that's actually not helping memory and is interrupting history in unhelpful ways is best explained by the principle of semantic gravity. Now, bear with me here because this is actually really helpful. It's not just a pile of words. All subjects have a particular relationship, don't they, between the particular and the general. And subjects actually differ in the extent to which they need the generalization and the particular underneath it. And a subject with heavy semantic gravity is a subject that's pulled down, very naturally pulled down into its particulars, its detail, its story, its example, the colours and richness and drama. History has very heavy semantic gravity. You can't lose the generalizations. If you don't have generalizations, you can't talk about appeasement or economic effects or tribal warfare. If you haven't got generalizations, you can't talk about anything. So you need a dance between the particular and the general. And actually, all quality history teaching is dependent on getting that dance right. Most of great feedback that a coach or a mentor gives is around, was that right? Did we need more general? Did we need more particular here? So great history teaching stands or falls on how well the general and particular are woven. And the history teacher's always thinking about that. And in your routine, if your routine formative assessment is constantly making generalizations intrude at the wrong stage, those sort of higher level concepts and abstractions, without sensitivity to their role in the unfolding puzzle, without making use of the satisfying sense of arrival that comes when a narrative makes them make sense, then we're at best missing opportunities to motivate, enable, and make history joyous and memorable. And at worst, we're killing it dead and making it really, really hard to remember. What you don't want to do is overload working memory. And as I said here, there's a great irony here, because often these things are done in the name of cognitive science. And cognitive science is helpful when it's applied sensibly. You don't want to overload working memory by inserting multiple choice just because you have to do it at that moment. What you don't want to do is reduce memorization to a knowledge organizer, which isn't helping with capturing historical meaning. Often because of its very poor or artificial relationship with the particulars that sustain it. So the last thing you want is assessment which breaks the spell.
Just before we move on to the last sort of question here, Christine, if anybody has a question to ask, obviously the chat is open there. So we might have time just for 1 or 2 really sort of quick fire questions at the end. So if you have a question based on anything we've discussed up to this point, please pop it in the chat and I'll try and pick 1 or 2 to throw into the interview at the end. So feel free to do that. The second thing, obviously, is keep tweeting your questions. If you use Twitter, or X, then you can use the hashtag TTHistory and do that, or tag us in at TTR History. So Christine, lastly, what does really great assessment look like in Key Stage 3 history?
Right. I'm going to try and summarize this crisply because I know we're run out of time, and remind people there are lots of answers to this in the article in Teaching History 193. I expect a lot of the questions being asked are probably answered there, and often they're not being answered by me, but I'm pointing you to other fantastic practice that is out there that we're all continuing to learn from, that's shared in forums like this, like yours, and also in Teaching History Journal and by the HA. But let me just try and pull it together. I would say really great assessment stays very close to history's natural forms of accounting, whether they are narrative or argument or a complex blend of the two. In formative assessment, the thing the teacher needs to be thinking about is, what do I need to check pupils have recalled at this point? And when do I need to check it? And what kind of thing? And what is the role of that security, that absolute rock solid security I need in the knowledge, that automaticity, in what we learned, say, last lesson or last week or last year? What role is that playing in placing pupils now in a heightened state of attention, so they're ready as this particular bit of the news story unfolds? What's its role in opening up the new possibilities of the inquiry question, which we've been steadily unpacking across this lesson sequence? Or moving up to the sort of slightly more formal but still formative assessment opportunities, it might be, say, a test that you want to do between inquiries. So let's just take one example. We're bang in the middle of year 9, say, and we choose to do an intensive, really fast, perhaps surprise, perhaps we don't want to do any revision for this, but a fast and intensive timeline test right here. And we're not soft on the recall of knowledge. My goodness, we're thorough about it. But we want to make sure that our knowledge from the last 2 inquiries, and maybe an inquiry back in year 7 or year 8, which is highly relevant to this one, is present for these pupils right now as we move into this new inquiry, where we're going to need that old knowledge to make this new journey interesting. I'm going to need them secure in that vocabulary. I'm going to need them secure in those reference points, the places, the stories, because we're going to be showing a new comparison with them. Or maybe it's something that follows on. Perhaps I was studying East African societies in the 10th century, and now I'm studying East African societies in the 14th century, whatever it is. Perhaps I'm studying Christianity or Islam in a different part of the world. I don't know. There's some connection. So I've got real reason to be rock solid secure in that old timeline. So I have a fast timeline, and I set my standards really high. And I want them to recall 100%. So it's not about going soft on recall at all. But I'm doing it right now because it's illuminating. I'm doing it right now because it's efficient, because it's going to directly help the next thing. And I'm doing it right now because the children are not going to be bored, because, you know, I might follow that timeline up with some really interesting analysis of it, which will beautifully segue into what I'm going to do next. So this is what I mean about the natural mode of accounting. Not only there are little narratives, but the whole thing can be thought of as a narrative. And you're choosing those moments and choosing what you will recall with great thoroughness, so that they serve and complement and proceed from those natural modes of accounting and make history more accessible to more pupils. In the end, great assessment secures inclusion. I think that's the key point I'd want to end on. It allows you to check that all pupils have accessed and can retain the prior knowledge and thinking that is unlocking the doors to the new stuff. And it doesn't end the enchantment. It doesn't break the spell.
Christine, absolutely fabulous. Enjoyed that interview. Unfortunately, we've run out